This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 630, entitled The Unconscious Roots of My Masculist Hatred of Fluffies. Description. This flyer explains how the negative experiences I had as a young boy of 12 years old probably played a major role in generating my hatred of fluffies and fluffy feminists. This early experience was later reinforced by more conscious negative experiences I had with women as an adult. Now, flyer itself. The Unconscious Roots of My Masculist Hatred of Fluffies by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. I have a Latin girlfriend, in brackets LAT equals living apart together, with whom I have a half-time relationship, spending roughly half my nights at her place and the rest at my place. At my last visit, I was talking about the rather poor relationship I had with my mother and the probable role she played in the creation of my masculist contempt for fluffies and fluffy feminists, the two main enemies of the masculists. This flyer reflects on the probable, perhaps largely unconscious, causes of my contempt for fluffies and fluffy feminists, claiming that a lot of them resulted from my experience with my own mother, and finishes off with a few other negative experiences I had with women, but were more on a conscious level. I start with a bit of psychological background to set the scene. My great-uncle, C.J. de Garis, was famous in Australia in his day. He was a businessman and entrepreneur who was the first businessman in Australia to own his own aeroplane. He really put the town of Mildura, M-I-L-D-U-R-A, on the Murray River that divides the two states of Victoria and New South Wales on the map by strongly promoting its dried fruit industry and many other business schemes. When one of his major financial schemes crashed due to a recession, he suicided, resulting in 3-inch headlines in the national newspapers, CJ dead. The newspapers didn't need to explain who CJ was, since his was a household name. My mother met my father as a nurse, treating my father for some eye problem. She was hypergamous and latched onto my father, who had the name de Garis. My father came from a divorced family and was utterly naive about women. He merely latched onto the first woman who wiggled her twat at him. It was a very bad marriage that barely survived. In the 80s, after she died, I remember asking my father, quote, "Dad, if you were of your kids' generation, would you have stayed with Mum?" Question mark. End quote. He answered back with no hesitation, no. Of the 5 members of our nuclear family, Dad, Mum, and the 3 kids, I was the brightest, in brackets, who grew up to be a full research professor in math, physics, and computer science, close brackets, and my mother was the dumbest. So the problem I had with my mother, due to the IQ gap, was unsolvable, since you can't change people's IQs. When I was still at home, in senior high school, in brackets, at a private school that my father paid for, at 17, 18 years of age, as my brain was wiring up in the adult pattern, I began to look on my mother as the silly woman, that is irrational, emotional, often hysterical, and as someone I could not take seriously, for whom I had no respect. Things got so bad between us that eventually, a few months before I was to leave home to take up residence in a university college, my father had a talk with me. I told him that the lack of respect I had for my mother was a temporary problem, since in a few months I'd be out of the house and off to university. He saw the logic of it, but asked me to make more effort to be civil with my own mother. I agreed and twiddled my thumbs while waiting to leave home to escape from female irrationality and silly-mindedness. My father was a rather slow developer, and my mother was hyper-ambitious, hypergamous, who channeled her ambition through her husband, my father. Since I'm almost 76 as I write this, July 2023, when I was 12 and growing up in the 50s and 60s, women were housewives, especially upper middle class women. I remember my father telling me at that age that, quote, "No wife of mine is ever going to work," end quote, with the implication that if his wife did work, then that reflected badly on his capacity to be successful as a breadwinner, that he was like a lower class man, since working women in those days tended to be lower class women who had to work since their lower class husbands earned little money. My mother channeled her ambition through her husband and felt frustrated due to, as she put it, his lack of drive. When I was 12, I heard many bitter arguments listening in my room upstairs between my parents about lack of money and my father's lack of drive, his, according to my mother, lack of ability to make more money. I suspect that my disdain towards money matters derives from my deep association between money matters and the fear I felt then that my parents might split. Even today, as an old man, 3/4 of a century old, I have to force myself to do admin tasks that involve money, for the simple reason that there is no one else to take care of my money admin shit. I think the first seeds of my masculinist contempt for fluffies, in brackets, a masculinist label for traditional women who expect to live off the money and labour of a man for decades of his life, close brackets, arose from listening to my mother bitch on my father, goading him, nagging him to make more money, to be more ambitious, to become more respect-worthy in her eyes. Even at 12 years old, I began to think, quote, "Why doesn't my mother get off her own fat ass and earn her own money if she wants more of it, rather than parasite off my father's money? Her kids were all at school. She had little to do all day and played tennis regularly with her female friends." Over my teenage years, this attitude grew in me and was compounded by my growing contempt for my mother due to her silliness, her lack of raw IQ. She was just not a bright woman, an attitude shared strongly by my 8-year younger sister, who was also very bright, in brackets, but not curious, not an intellectual, close brackets, who had an even greater contempt for her, my mother, than I did, since her mother used to beat her until she was 15. I think the marriage between my father and my mother was doomed from the start. They should never have married. As my father matured as a late developer, he ended up being more successful economically than my mother had imagined. So she toned down over the years, and by the mid-70s, with her kids off her hands and the rise of feminism in the 70s, she went back to work as a nurse, earned her own money and invested it very successfully in real estate and made quite a killing, channeling her considerable ambition into herself rather than parasiting off the efforts and ambition of a man. As a masculist, I have a deep-rooted hatred of female parasitism for the above reasons. When I hear of some female expecting to live off the money and labour of a man, very strong red flags go up in my mind, along with a powerful sense of existential injustice when a woman, a fluffie, expects to be able to live off the labour and money of a man for decades of his life, thus manslaving him, and in one case in 4 of married fathers, divorce raping him and ruining his life. This powerful sense of gender injustice pushed me to a hatred of fluffies and fluffy feminists, so that later in life I became a masculist theorist, a role that came naturally to me, since as a full science research professor with 150 plus research publications to my name, writing masculist theory was rather easy for me. For decades, I had been writing research papers in artificial brains, my area of expertise. So once the idea occurred to me to devote that ability to men's issues, I took to the task readily, since I had all the necessary prerequisites, namely the ability to write theory, the necessary sense of gender injustice resulting from the horrible things that women do to men, with women's many awful, decades-lasting gender crimes against men. For example, women's manslavery, women's divorce rape, women's forced fathering, etc. Close brackets. And a rather iconoclastic personality that actually enjoyed lashing out at the currently dominant gender political status quo of feminism. Over the past 8 years, since 2015, I have written over 600 masculist flyers. That is, 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW. Each flyer/essay is often a continuation of the ideas of the previous flyer, generating a progression of masculist ideas over that period that has been extensive, so has generated a ton of masculist ideas. Sooner or later, I feel obliged to write a shortish book of, say, 200 pages or less that summarizes the main ideas of masculism, presenting them in a linear, logical manner that is very persuasive and relatively succinct, that is, not in the current form of 600 plus essays that take up tomes of many hundreds of pages each, that only students in a men's studies course could be bothered to read them all. At a more conscious level, there are several other negative experiences I have had with women that have reinforced my masculist hatred of fluffies and fluffy feminists, who are the masculist's two main enemies. One is pure intellectual conviction, arguing that, quote, "Now that women can work, they must work, since anything else is manslavery, and manslavery will get women killed," end quote. By this I mean that, thanks to men's discovery of science-based medicine, women now have a life expectancy of 85 years. Men gave women the pill, household gadgets, and higher education, so women now have a career window of half a century. Even those women who stay at home for some years to raise small children. Thus the masculists are standing up and pointing the finger at women, telling them if they don't FIP up, in brackets FIP, F-I-P, equals financially independent person, then they will be seen by the masculists as manslavers, who are therefore so morally abhorrent that these fluffies deserve to be exterminated, that is, by being totally ignored, not even pumped and dumped, since the masculists, fluffydom is manslavery, and manslavery is slavery, and hence hated and a war issue to masculists, who see manslavery as 1,000 times, literally, worse problem than was Negro slavery in the 1800s in the US, which ended up a war issue, killing over 500,000 US soldiers. Masculists have a hatred of fluffies, seeing them as vile, manslaving, divorce-raping vermin, to be exterminated, to be wiped off the face of the earth, to be utterly rejected, attacked with vicious masculist hatred, and forced to rot on the shelf, dying a slow, miserable death, so that humanity creates a FIP society, capital F, capital S, in which both sexes, especially young girls, are socialized by parents and taught by teachers to be FIPs so that they don't manslave some man. The FIPPing of women, the creation of a FIP society, is one of the fundamental political goals of the masculists. In earlier flyers, I have talked about how I felt bitter that society did not tell me beforehand how horrible being a manslave can be, working in a soulless job just to earn money to support a fluffy wife so she can raise her kids in a house that he pays for. I felt I lost 6 years of my life being a manslave to a fluffy. Later in life, one of my wives stole half my savings that I could not recover due to the feminist and national bias of the court system of the country I was living in at the time. These very negative experiences only reinforce my hatred of fluffies and fluffy feminists. As a masculist, I see masculism having as deep a historical effect on society, on the planet, as feminism had. That will transform society, changing it into one that is fair to men by making deep changes in society and the gender laws. Women will be forced by masculism to grow up, to fit up, to take responsibility for their own lives and not blame men for everything as feminists do, which is seen by masculists as childish and contemptible. Now that men have their own gender political ideology, that is masculism, men, masculists, are now in a position to take the gender political initiative so that women will be reacting to the claims of the masculists rather than the other way round, which has been the case for the past 6 decades during the 6-decade monopoly of feminism over gender politics. Masculists are now political and hateful, expressing that hatred at fluffies and fluffy feminists, aiming to wipe them off the face of the earth by being at war with them, to wipe out the traditional man-slave role of the man, by pushing women to share half the burden of earning the living, by fipping up, or to suffer a horrible punishment by being forced by the masculists to rot on the shelf, dying a slow, miserable death, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, utterly rejected, socially and sexually, and spat at. We men, we masculists, have the power to do this, since most men are fips, and we are doing it, creating a very different world in which feminists no longer have a monopoly over gender politics. And if they think they do, then the masculists in their social circles will bite their fucking heads off. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man-Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 630 plus masculist flyers for men's studies courses. Freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. These flyers are available in text and video formats on Minds, BitChute,